Israel and Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement, agreed to a ceasefire after 11 days of a bloody conflict that killed at least 232 Palestinians, including 65 children, and 12 people in Israel, including 2 children. The truce seems to be holding after taking effect early on Friday morning, but some clashes between police and demonstrators have been reported. One person who believes strongly that Hamas is at the center of the violence in the region is politician, diplomat and activist Ruth Wasserman Lande. She spent some of her school years in South Africa and served as a member of the Knesset, that's the National Legislature of Israel, and for the Blue and the White Party in 2 short spells in early 2021. My colleague Peter Ndoro spoke to her earlier in the week in Ethiopia before the ceasefire was announced.
Ruth Wasserman Lande, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the program. Welcome to you.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
It's been a very difficult, almost 2 weeks now of this current crisis, this current round of extreme violence. I can't think of another way to describe it. How has it been for you inside Israel?
Very, very difficult. I think that having approximately 75% of the population cower in security rooms, in really safe rooms against rockets is, it's crazy. It's very difficult to describe. One needs to really feel the heart pounding inside your body. When you hear the siren, it's almost like the siren comes from within the body. And then you get so used to hearing it that any motorcycle, any kind of a sound that sounds almost like the siren makes you jump. And I'm saying this as somebody who lives quite a distance from the border. I'd like to share with you, Peter, that all the towns and cities on the border of Gaza within Israel have been living like this for 20 odd years, with little children running to the safe room in 15 seconds. They have 15 seconds between listening and hearing the siren and life and death, which is, it's surreal, it's crazy, it's not normal in any way, and quite frankly creates a lot of post-traumatic reality amidst a lot of people, civilians.
I would imagine as a mother, you're concerned for your children, but at the same time, you can also imagine what's happening inside Gaza, for example, as buildings come down and hundreds of people are losing their lives and are being rescued from rubble.
The situation in Gaza Strip is absolutely tragic. As a human being, as a person, as Ruth, without any titles, just as plain person, you cannot stay apathetic to the tragedy that has beholden the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. I'd like to share with you, Peter, and with the listeners, the fact that the Hamas leadership that has been receiving, frankly, mountains of dollars from Qatar with our help, with Israeli help. I'm not sure how well represented that is in the international media, but the purpose thereof is to help the population with infrastructure, with schooling, with technology, has been navigating this money for years into building an underground metro system, which is a method forwarded by the leader of the armed wing of Hamas, Hamadef, in order to attack Israel from underground. So it's underground tunnels, a whole city of tunnels under Gaza in order to attack Israel. And they make no secret of it, by the way. They say it plainly in Arabic again and again. One can check my words. It's not something that anyone made up. They say it plainly. The purpose is to destroy the Zionist entity, meaning the state of Israel, not to the 67 borders, but to its very core. In other words, before and prior to 1948, when it was first established. So as a human being, not only do I feel the pain of the mothers in Gaza, I feel that they are being taken hostage by a very cynical, very warring, from the word war and not to worry, leadership that is holding this poor population hostage for so many years without proper water, without infrastructure, without a possibility to really express themselves, because God forbid if they do, they're not going to be with us any longer.
Do you think the Israeli authorities perhaps are using excessive force, because it's civilians that are ending up homeless? It is Palestinian schools that have left more than 41,000 children affected. It's almost as if, yes, Hamas might be the problem, but the civilians get caught up in this.
Absolutely, Peter. You know, from your mouth to God's ears, as a person who believes in God, I'd like to tell you that it is a godless act which Hamas is perpetrating. And I'm not citing words that I'm being told to cite. I'm speaking as a mother and as a God-fearing person. You know, Hamas is shooting from schools, from clinics, from personal homes, from hospitals. This is inhumane. In fact, it is using its own people as human shields. Now, what the IDF is doing is the following. When it needs to shoot back, because I cannot imagine that any person in their right mind can possibly tell a country that is being shot at thousands of rockets into proper civilian population to do nothing. We need to make this aggression stop. This is inhumane, and it's killing civilians. The fact that Israeli government has the technology and has the care to protect its citizens by the Iron Dome and by other mechanisms, by talking to the people, and certainly not shooting from civilian populations, God forbid, and doing everything within its possible power to protect its civilians is one thing. But the Hamas is shooting from civilian population. And what happens is the IDF needs to shoot back. What does it do? It has its representatives call, there are proof of this, in Arabic, the owners of the various points. If it's a hospital, the owner of the hospital or the CEO of the hospital. If it's the owner of a building, the owner of the building, in order to give them time to evacuate all the people. There are even proof of IDF soldiers speaking in Arabic and begging the people there to take the children out of the building so that they will not be hurt. The purpose of the IDF and of Israel is certainly not to hurt civilians, but it seems as if we have more empathy towards the Gazan population, the Palestinian population, that are as human as Israeli than their own leadership, which is murderous and is quite honestly perpetrating heinous crimes.
All right, Ruth, I mean, you know, again, people will say Hamas might be shooting out of civilian populations, but the Israeli authorities are shooting into civilian populations. I was heartbroken this week to see a story of a 6-year-old child who was pulled out of rubble after 7 hours, only to find out her mother was dead and her 4 siblings had died. We're hearing reports that not everybody gets a notification, because I can't think a father would receive a notification and stay in a building knowing that it's going to come, bomb, and kill his children. It just doesn't seem to make sense.
It doesn't make sense, but I want to share with you that only today I received a recording of a conversation by an IDF representative speaking in Arabic to a father. The situation there is so dire. The father says he knows he's being recorded. They know that the Hamas is listening, that they might as well stay there with their children. This is the honorable thing to do, which is a terrible thing to say. I remind you that they also send people to explode themselves in a manner which is completely not something that is fathomable to somebody who has children, who is from the Western world and hemisphere, and yet they do have an ideology which almost makes death more holy than life itself. And yet what you say about the 6-year-old, about the children, about the mothers is heartbreaking. But you know, I want to share with South African listeners that there are mothers in Israel too that have lost sons, that have lost children to these rockets being fired endlessly and tirelessly into civilian populations, and yet speak of peace. We are tired of war. We are sick of war. We don't want it anymore. It's enough. The Hamas charter says plainly, until the last breath is taken out of the Israeli entity, we shall not rest until the entire Israel shall be finished. If anybody has better advice as to how to deal with this absolutely impossible situation, I'm sure we will be open to hear. By the way, Peter, trucks full of humanitarian aid were transported to Kerem Shalom. That's the crossing that was bombarded in 2014 by Hamas. It's the crossing enabling goods and humanitarian aid to go into Gaza. Our soldiers stopped the fighting yesterday morning, took the trucks into Kerem Shalom, and were being shot at while doing so in order to have humanitarian aid for them. This is not a normal thing that armies do in any kind of fighting. It's not a normal situation.
Ruth, again, I'm going to ask about excessive force. Israel has said that they've, in this past week, hit 820 different targets. The whole of last year, it was only 180. So we're talking in 1 week times 4 what you did in the whole of last year.
Very true.
Is
very
that
true.
Excessive?
Well, it's very, Peter, I have truly a lot of respect for South African listeners, and that's why I shall answer not gently, but respectfully in a very truthful manner. Excessive is a word which is an adjective that needs to be put next to a situation which is measurable, which one can see and one can feel. If one was sitting on the towns and cities next to the Gaza border from within Israel for 20 years and feeling the rockets again and again and again and again with the rhetoric, we are out to destroy you. What is excessive? Second of all, over 2,000 rockets were sent this time, much more than last year. The Hamas wanted to show its force, that its hand is on the, that it's powerful, that it can be the savior of the Palestinian people, of destroying Israel. It says that in Arabic. very clearly. It makes no secret of its intentions. The excessive use of those rockets equals the excessive answer. And again, the attempt is to hurt as few civilians as possible. Is it absolutely possible to not hurt anyone? God forgive all those mistakes that are being made, that are unintentional. Each life is a world. In Judaism, you say that if you save one life, you save a whole entire world. There is a proverb saying that. But Israeli civilians can no longer sustain this irrational, inhumane, unbelievable situation. I ask your listeners, Peter, if 2,000 rockets were now sent on Johannesburg, don't think of Israel. Don't think of Palestine. It's far away. It's difficult to imagine. Think of Johannesburg. Think of all the people that don't have a proper security room. Think of all the people in your country stopping to work. Their businesses are dead. The restaurants are not working. The shops are closed. Again and again, the children running underground, post-traumatic, sirens, rockets flying over your heads in Johannesburg. Would you not expect your government to protect you?
Okay.
Would you expect them to speak to those people who are throwing thousands of rockets at your civilians for their wish to destroy you? It's inhumane.
All right. Let's talk about this current cycle of violence, because what's happened over the years is that we have these cycles coming and going, and often we're not quite able to see what sparked it. What do you think this round of violence was caused by?
Okay, so the Hamas this time used the tension that began in Jerusalem between the Israeli police and the Palestinians in the area surrounding the holy places, both the Western Wall and the holy site of Al-Aqsa for the Muslims, as the reason, the declarative reason to free the world, the Islamic world of Israel, and to free Al-Aqsa, plainly saying it. In fact, they are wishing and telling the intermediaries, the Egyptians, that they wish a statement by the Israelis regarding Jerusalem in order to finish this round, this current round, because they have declared war on Israel with the rockets this time around in order to save the Islamic world and Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa. So this time around, it was not for, at least declaratively, the citizens of Gaza, because on a regular basis, they are receiving loads of cash, dollars from Qatar, with our help, with Israeli help. If I agree with that or not, that's for perhaps another interview, but that's the reality. The Hamas is receiving loads of money from Qatar in order to help their citizens. Are they helping their citizens? They have no water, they have no infrastructure, they have no jobs. 70% of the young people in Gaza are on drugs because of the lack of hope. You can blame everything on Israel, it's easy. But I think that intelligent audiences need to check just a tad more. What is that leadership doing to its own people?
So, Ruth, why was the police in the Al-Aqsa Mosque? Why were they use the word aggression, the Muslims that were praying in their holy month? I mean, surely
of Ramadan.
Yeah, a man and his religion is one thing that will definitely provoke. So for police to come inside a mosque and harass, manhandle worshippers. What kind of reaction do you think that would get?
Okay, I thank you for that very candid question and difficult question, Peter, because it's something that needs to be explained. The mosque, Al-Aqsa Mosque, is situated in the very place where the Western Wall is. The Israeli authorities have separated the entrances so that Jews can go to their holy part, the Western Wall, and Muslims can go onto what we call Jews, Har Bayit, the Temple Mount, which is also holy to us, to Jews. The Jews, in order not to incite, have not been allowed by Israeli authorities for years to go up to Temple Mount because it's irritating. I'm not saying this sarcastically, but seriously. It is a very sensitive issue, as you say, and not to irritate or aggravate any kind of sensitive situation of worshippers on the Temple Mount. And that has been the case for years. The police has gathered around Al-Aqsa Mosque on Ramadan, and in fact, it worked out that Laylat al-Qadr, the very, very holiest of holy nights of the Ramadan, coincided with the day of Jerusalem that the Jews and Israelis celebrate, in order to make sure, perhaps in a mistaken way, that no rioting would take place, no infighting between the Jewish celebrators and the Palestinian and Arab Muslim worshippers. Now, what we see from pictures from within are people carrying rocks into the Holy of Holies, into the mosque. Should the police have been there, which is by sight, by the visual aspect of them being there, it is aggravating in a manner of their being there. What are they there for? Why do they need to be there? I understand that. But let me remind you that every year, when the fire of fires goes out from the very holy church of the Sepulchre in Jerusalem, our police is also there. Do you know why? Because the different sects of Christianity fight in and amidst themselves who would make the round first. So ironically, Israeli police, military police, guards that no fighting will take place and everything will be in order, which is crazy. But Jerusalem and this area is so sensitive, it's crazy. And thank God everything is peaceful every year with the Christian sects. That was the intention of the police existence and surrounding when it all began. It did aggravate. And Palestinian worshippers, I'm not talking about the majority that are peaceful. I'm talking about those that wanted to create aggravation and wanted to create a kind of a confrontation, brought in rocks and began to throw rocks. And I don't know what you call them, but those things that explode, the small things that explode, into the Holy of Holies. There are pictures to prove that, because it's all has CCTV around it from within.
It worked.
And that is when things really began to get out of hand. I just want to add, Peter, hundreds of thousands of Muslims are already praying for days in Al-Aqsa, quietly, peacefully. There are pictures that go out of there already for days. I wish I could share with you right now those pictures. It calms me, it calms my heart and mind to see that, because that is how things should be. Peaceful and all able to worship peacefully in their own places of holy worship.
People say that what actually perhaps led up to this was the occupations in Jerusalem, the evictions of Israeli Arabs being told that they must leave their houses so that settlers could come in. And I just wonder if you can explain that to us, that, you know, you live in a house for your lifetime, and then one day a court says, actually, you have to give up your house. And this again looks like something that would provoke.
Absolutely. I thank you for asking me that question too, because it allows me to explain. Sheikh Jarrah is a neighborhood in East Jerusalem, on the border of East and West Jerusalem, in which Palestinians live without an ownership of those particular houses in that neighborhood for over 70 years. If you ask my personal opinion, they should have been left to live there in order not to aggravate, but it's not their property. And this is a legal, technical statement that I'm making. Sometimes, Peter, you need to be smart and not right. Now, because of the sensitivity of the situation, the court has postponed its decision. The Israeli authorities have asked the court not to rule. The technical cold ruling is that those Palestinians do not actually own those particular houses. By the way, there are many, many, many pieces of land in the state of Israel proper. I'm not talking about the other side of the green line, that Palestinians have papers to prove their ownership of the land. And the Israeli High Court of Law, if it is being approached, will decide that it is Palestinian. In this particular case, it is not Palestinian. And yet, I personally believe that it should not have been dealt with because of the sensitivity of the issue and the aggravation that it caused needlessly. I just want to remind the audience as well that the tenants have been approached again and again to pay rent to the real owners. By the way, they are not settlers, they are just Jewish. And those tenants refused again and again to pay rent. Again, this is a technical issue, but the repercussions thereof are much higher. There are also some MKs from the far right in Israel that have aggravated further the situation, and a lot of rioters on the Palestinian side that have done a lot of violent acts on their side to further aggravate. So what I'm saying, Peter, if we put the margins, both Jewish and Palestinian aside, the vast majority of people want to live in peace.
All right, let's talk about wider occupation, because there are areas that Israel has occupied against international law, condemned by the United Nations. How is that justified?
Look, Peter, the story of the settlements is a complex one. After 67, I'm not going to give the listeners a history lesson, but it is an issue that has been put on the table as something to speak about, to negotiate about, and decide upon in the final agreement status. Are we anywhere near that? Not anywhere near, unfortunately. Do we have a leadership? I promise I will answer. Do we have a leadership on the other side that is representative of the people with whom Israel can speak and can reach agreements? I wish I could say yes, but we have the Fatah in the West Bank and we have Hamas in Gaza. Hamas plainly says that its ideology, it's written black and white on its charter, the destruction of the state of Israel, full stop. The Palestinian Authority leadership, the Fatah, is in a very precarious situation because it does not enjoy the full legitimacy of its own people. In fact, its own street is crying out against a lot of corruption and a lot of mismanagement of the situation there. That's not the whole story. Nobody here is absolutely perfect. neither my country nor the Palestinian Authority. But the truth and the facts are that the Palestinian Authority leadership does not represent the street in a manner that can withhold those people from actually doing what it will agree or not agree with the state of Israel in any kind of negotiation. In fact, Abu Mazen will not sit down with a government in Israel to negotiate. I will be very frank with you. We currently do not have a government in Israel that is willing to negotiate with Abu Mazen either. And I represent a party, the Blue and White Party, that has said in its own vision that if there is a will on the other side to negotiate, to agree to not violently have a two-state solution, we are more than interested to examine that possibility. Is it easy? Is it easily reachable? Very, very, very far from it. In fact, brilliant people from the United States, Israel, the West Bank, the Arab world, and more have tried for over 73 years and have not yet succeeded. It's complex, but there is a wish. The current government in Israel has a complex vision regarding its inability to negotiate with the Palestinian leadership. But I must be honest, I must be fair. The Palestinian leadership shows no signs of willingness on its side to negotiate either in any way.
All right. Again, I'll ask you, are these settlements legal? The international community says they're not. And even if the Palestinians themselves can't agree on a way forward and they're fighting amongst themselves, it still doesn't justify Israeli settlements in their territory.
And this is an issue to be left for the final status negotiations, like the very sensitive issue of Jerusalem, like the very sensitive issue that the Palestinians have put on the table forever, and that is the return of all the refugees, meaning literally, de facto, the destruction of the state of Israel in its current form. So these sensitive issues, and they are very sensitive to those people living in those cities and towns, need to be resolved, have been dealt with in previous negotiations by former Prime Minister Olmert, by former Prime Minister Ehud Barak. They've been dealt with. They've been addressed.
Ruth?
Anybody who needs to check can examine the protocols.
Are they legal?
Internationally, they are not recognized as legal. Everybody knows that. It's on the international media. Again, these are issues such as the refugees in Jerusalem to be finalized in final status negotiations.
All right, so you are somebody who understands peace talks very well. You did a thesis actually based on the framework of the Oslo Accords. So you understand the processes of these negotiations. Why have they been failing over the decades?
I think that there's been a very difficult and impactful decision made by the Palestinian leadership over the decades, not being courageous enough to make that step and to end the conflict. I think that a lot of the rhetoric on the Palestinian side is harnessed by a kind of ideology to return all the lands to the Muslims, to the Arabs, and so on. And that leader who shall negotiate and reach an agreement with the state of Israel, which is anything less than the full story, shall be seen as weak, shall be seen as giving in to the Zionist entity, which is myself, other mothers, fathers, children, and 10 million people, including, by the way, the Arab population within Israel.
So do you think given what's been playing out this nearly 2 weeks now, that there is a path to some kind of sitting down and some kind of negotiations, or is it going to take this generation of leadership to disappear and a new generation to come through with different ideas?
I think that there are certain levels, different levels in the answer to your question, Peter. There is the current shooting of rockets, the incessant, constant shooting of rockets by Hamas into civilian Israeli population, by the way, both Arab and Jewish. 2 Muslim people have been killed by a rocket, a father and a 16-year-old girl, Muslims of Israeli citizenship, by those same rockets. They simply don't care. They've sent their rockets into Jerusalem, into Arab towns and cities like Taibe, in which only Arabs live. And this incessant shooting is one part of the answer. Can it be sustained by any leadership, right wing, left wing? No. Just like South African leadership will never agree to having its own population bombarded endlessly, tirelessly over years with rockets. This is insane. And this is part of the Palestinian population in Gaza. The West Bank leadership, Fatah, had declared to have democratic elections. The reason why there was this kind of tension prior to Jerusalem and prior to all this fighting is that it canceled those elections in which it was sure that it will lose and Hamas will gain power in the West Bank. Hamas was angry and wanted to prove its strength to the people and fire up the emotions in the West Bank, succeeding, I would say, half-half. The fighting between Fatah in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza is, I think, worse than the hatred between Israelis and Palestinians. What does that mean, Peter? Is that with whom do we make peace? With the entity that says that needs to destroy us completely? Of course not. With an entity that does not fully represent its own people in the West Bank and certainly does not control Gaza, very, very complex situation. Therefore, this complex situation needs brilliant minds, outstanding, out-of-the-box solutions. But I want to say something. Did we believe a few years ago, or even a year ago, that we'll have the Abraham Accords, that Israel will be in a peace agreement with Bahrain, with the UAE, almost with Saudi Arabia, with Morocco, with Sudan? No, it was a dream, an absolute dream. I have to believe, Peter, I have to believe. And there are good people in this country. There are good, sound, sensible, value-oriented people in the leadership in this country. Not everybody that can do the right thing. Please, God. And we also need the support, your support, to understand that the situation is not black and white. It's not 1 or 0. It's not clear-cut. It's reality, and reality is complex.
Some things are complex for sure, but if you are living in Gaza and your right to move around is restricted, there are blockades around your territory, people, in fact, last week I spoke to the Palestinian ambassador to South Africa, and she described living in Palestine as living in the biggest open-air prison in the world, that you can't move, you're restricted, you need the permits for this, permits for that. You can't visit relatives in the West Bank if you're in Gaza. I mean, all of these kinds of restrictions surely are breeding people who will find ways to become free by whatever means necessary.
The restrictions, Peter, are a fruit of the endless attempts of suicide murders orchestrated by the Palestinian leadership amidst civilian population, because their stated vision is the destruction of the state of Israel. Do we want to close the border to Gaza? No. Do we want freedom of tourism, of cooperation on the commercial front, scientific front? Yes. Can we allow the border to be open? It's suicide. By the way, Gaza has a border, a common border with Egypt as well. Is the border open there? No. Does anybody ask why? No. How does that make sense? How? How does that make sense? Also, the Palestinian ambassador in South Africa, I would imagine, lives in the West Bank and not in Gaza, because she represents the Fatah and not the Hamas. At least that's what I would imagine would be sending the ambassadors abroad. The foreign ministry of the Fatah would do that. And therefore she would not live in Gaza, but rather in Ramallah or in other cities, in Nablus. I invite you to visit those cities, Peter. Some of them are very nice, very beautiful. I've been there. Things are not perfect. You cannot enter Israel without any question, but you can enter Israel with permission, and provided you don't want to bomb yourself amidst a civilian population. And also, I would encourage the audience to look at the residence of the Prime Minister, Abu Mazen, in the West Bank. The mansions in which he lives and the rest of his family do not do the Palestinian people a lot of pride.
Help me understand another thing that I've always been curious about. If you are Jewish anywhere in the world, if you decide that you want to go to Israel and go and settle and go home, as it were, you can. But Palestinians don't have the same opportunity. Why is that? Isn't that some kind of discrimination?
Okay, I'll answer your question gladly. The State of Israel was established in order to be and serve as a sanctuary for the Jewish people worldwide after thousands of years of persecution, the hardest and the most dreadful of which was in the Holocaust, killing over 6 million Jewish people simply because they were Jews. Some of them were gassed in the gas chambers. Some of them were murdered in holes, big holes which they were made to dig themselves, and so on. Anti-Semitism, by the way, is on the rise everywhere, in Europe, in the United States, in South Africa, unfortunately, in many places around the world. There's one place that is the biblical Holy Land. Any believer knows, read the Old Testament, and this country was reestablished in 1948 for the purpose of serving as a sanctuary from that anti-Semitism and from those persecutions, stating that if you are a Jew, you will always have the right of return and you will be able to live here. There are 2 million Arab citizens of Israel living in Israel. They live far better than in Palestine, in Syria, in Jordan, in Egypt, and so on and so forth. They have the rights to vote. They have the right to build homes. That we have high judges in the High Court of Law who are Arab Muslims and Arab Christians. We have CEOs of large hospitals and so on and so forth. So those who wanted to stay were permitted to stay knowingly by the Israeli authorities at the time of the establishment that they were Palestinian in origin. And 2 million of our population of 10 million are Arabs.
Okay, these are original Arabs, I'll use that word, but no new Arabs can come, right?
Well, that's not true either, because some people marry, for example, in the Negev, in the south of Israel, if you marry a woman from Gaza, from the West Bank, one can go check. A lot of them import so-called women to marry. Usually it's the women and not the men, but there's also the other way around. And they come and live in Israel and receive citizenship.
But they're still original Arabs, though, aren't they? Part of that marriage, it's still the originals.
No. They are no. I'm saying from Gaza Strip and from the West Bank, the Israeli Arabs marry them and bring them to Israel, and then they become Israeli citizens, and their children become Israeli citizens.
But these are Israeli Arabs. That's what I'm saying. A person.
Israeli Arabs, yes, who marry people, Palestinians from outside.
What about, let's say, Mr. and Mrs. Mohammed in West Bank wants to live in Israel? He can't.
To the best of my knowledge, they can't. In fact, it's a very good question. I need to check that, but I think that they can't. And neither can any Jewish person buy a house in Ramallah. Nobody will sell them a Jewish house. They're not permitted to own land. The Jewish state is the sanctuary of the Jewish people in order to allow the Jewish people throughout the world to have one safe haven from the persecutions throughout the world.
Imagine for a moment that the United Kingdom said that anybody who belongs to the Church of England can come back and live in England just by virtue of the fact that they are Anglican. And if you're Catholic, if you're Muslim, if you are Jewish, you are not allowed to come and live in the United Kingdom. That's essentially what we're saying here.
It's essentially the wrong way of looking at it, with your permission and with all respect. Why? Because people from the UK are not under any kind of persecutions anywhere at all. The Jewish people have been prone to persecutions throughout the centuries, currently as we speak as well. Not only that, but the multifaceted society which makes up Israel is Jewish and Muslim and Druze and even Baha'i, who are considered to be non-believers by Islamic countries and have been also persecuted. They've received a home in Israel, in Haifa, with a huge temple, because we know that they're not going to do anything bad to the Jewish people. There are Druze people, there are Bedouins from the south, there are Bedouins from the north. As I said, the 22% of the population is non-Jewish. So one cannot say that it is completely homogeneous. On the contrary, a significant percentage is non-Jewish, and there is the full rights of voting and so on. Is the UK the same as Israel? Of course not. Is France the same as Israel? Of course not. Does anybody persecute a French person because they are French? No, at all. Does anybody persecute in current day Catholics or Greek Orthodox, for example? By the way, we have all churches, Greek Orthodox, Catholic, we have Catholic Orthodox. We have so many denominations, all respected. Why? Because they're not out to persecute the Jewish people. There's full freedom of religion in this country. And if you want to show me one other Muslim country in the region, not in the Gulf, that has full freedom of religion, more than welcome. Jews in Syria have been ousted. Jews from Egypt in 1954, ousted, especially in 1956 completely. All the belongings has been nationalized. In all Arab countries, they have no place but this safe haven, very differently, inherently differently from the UK, from France, and from other nations.
Do you think that sentiment internationally is starting to perhaps sway away a little bit from Israel, particularly
Yes.
given what happened this week? And
Yes.
is it that you're misunderstood, or is it that they know something that, or they see something that you're not seeing?
I think it's us seeing something that they are not seeing, and I cannot blame anybody. Seeing things on international media and social media is very superficial. It's only on the level of messages, PR. You know, there are so many fake pictures being circulated by the Hamas of babies. And after a few days, you see that those babies are Russian baby models that are being circulated as a dead child that is not even near dead. Bodies that have come to life, have risen to life after being, carried to a funeral. And yet there are people who die as well. People, civilian population that is being bombarded. I want to remind you, Peter, the Hamas is not a democratic rule. They don't allow anyone to speak but their own official line. They don't allow any picture to come out except what they authorize. They only show civilians. Where are all those Hamas operatives? Poof, gone, into thin air. They do not exist, but they do. They shoot our civilians.
What's going to bring down the temperature? What's going to...
It's going to come down in a few hours or a few days. Why? Because Hamas is a little bit exhausted because of the Israeli shooting and hurting its own metro or underground tunnels, which they built to attack Israel. They're a little bit exhausted and they want a little bit of a break. Are they going to shoot again? I believe that they will. What is to happen? That's a very good question. This incessant shooting of rockets is unsustainable, absolutely atrocious. And the people who suffer most are the people that are held hostage by this ruthless leadership called Hamas. And those are the people in Gaza. That's why so many people there, young people, are on drugs because they see no hope.
So how do we get the leadership on both sides to, I mean, when I see some of the language that's being used from both sides, it's one that incites hate. It's one that is provocative and almost playing to an audience or trying to play to an audience. And my fear...
Can you give me an example, Peter, of a hateful rhetoric said by Israel, please?
All right. I'm just going to find something here now. It was issued by the Israeli embassy here. It says, in the last 9 days, Hamas murderous terrorist organization. Why would you write that in an official statement?
Because they are murdering innocent civilians intentionally, not by error. They are throwing rockets intentionally, and they rhetorically state their intention. They do not hide it. We want to murder Israeli civilians. We want to destroy the state of Israel. How is that not murderous? That's what they say, and that's not what they say only. That's what they do. How is that not murderous?
What I'm suggesting is, when you see language like this, coming from official sources, all it does is create more animosity. Yes, you may have your beliefs that they are murderous, that they are this, but if
It's not a matter of belief, Peter. I want to invite you, and I want to invite a delegation of respectable, intelligent people like yourself to Israel. And I want to have you hosted by the warm, beautiful families in the kibbutzim and the small towns along the Gaza border. You will never believe what you see. You will never be the same again. You will not return to South Africa and be the same Peter. I give you my word, and I invite you wholeheartedly, truly, to see with your eyes, not through my eyes, not through the eyes of any embassy, but with your own eyes. Murderous is the word and no other, not because of hate.
I don't want to be seen to be taking sides, because I think the language from the other side is equally incendiary, equally.
But this is not a symmetrical issue. It's not a matter of, the issue is a terror organization has taken hostage 2 million reasonable, normative men, women, children, and the elderly, put them in impossible conditions with huge tons of money from the international arena, including Qatar, which we are facilitating Israel. And instead of helping their people, they shoot from civilian populations, use them as human shields from hospitals. How cynical can anybody be? From kindergartens to shoot rockets, how cynical can people be? And then to state that Israel is daring to protect its own citizens.
Ruth?
I fail to comprehend how anybody cannot understand. And that's why I'm saying, Peter, again, and I stand by my invitation. Please don't trust my words. Come feel it. Come feel it. Empathy is a two-way emotion. Come feel what it's like for 12-year-old kids to wet their beds because of post-trauma for years, shuddering every single time a door is closed. I invite you to feel this, This is a nation growing on post-trauma. If you don't believe, please come and see and feel for yourself. We are all human beings, all of us, God-fearing human beings. As a God-fearing man, Peter, and I also believe in God, I want you to feel and see so that you can address your audience truthfully and with credibility and explain to them, this is craziness, unsustainable, murdering of innocent people and holding their poor population as hostage. It's heinous.
Okay. Ruth Wasserman Lande, Israeli politician, diplomat, and activist. Thank you so much for giving us so much time to explore these issues. And let's hope that you all, both sides, find that middle ground that can bring peace and lasting peace to your region.
Please, 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 God, inshallah. Thank you so much, Peter, for your willingness to listen and to hear.